Africa, although known as the cradle of mankind, is a fact that natural conditions and scattered migrations have kept this continent in a fog of underdevelopment for thousands of years. Except for the developed North African countries, such as the pinnacle of Egypt or later the vast Ottoman Empire, from the Sahara Desert down, everything is almost a desert of civilization. And on the European journey of exploration, there is nothing more convenient than using superior strength and science and technology to enslave the countries here. And Africa is indeed an ideal destination for the tests of strength from the countries with hegemonic ideology on the old continent. Indeed, the Europeans have never conquered a continent as easily as Africa. In South America, the Spanish and Portuguese were victorious, like cutting bamboo, because the gap between their technology and firepower and the native Indians was only the beginning. But the South Americans were so united and quick to learn that they learned to make their own crude colonial guns from stolen prototypes. As for Asia, the Western colonists faced nations with unparalleled sovereignty, culture, military, and unity. Although they still managed to subdue almost all of their weaker opponents, it was clear that the conquest of Asia was the most difficult game they had ever attempted. As for Africa, they not only won easily, but sometimes without even having to fight. With their greedy nature, with immediate benefits, and especially lacking solidarity, Africans easily became prey for white colonialists. Sadly, this place also witnessed many stories of Africans betraying each other for the torn money that colonialists threw as a reward for those who had the will to betray their compatriots. It is both pitiful and blameworthy. South America belongs to the Spanish and Portuguese. North America is the battlefield of France and England. In Asia, in addition to the four talents mentioned above, there is also the Dutch guy. It can be said that each market has its own big boss. However, in Africa, everyone has a share. A militarily incompetent country that only regained independence in the mid-19th century took Ethiopia, and a slow-witted Germany took Cameroon. Of course, Britain and France are still the big players in the African game. France owns the largest area with 20 different territories, accounting for 40% of the Black Continent. Not as much as France, but England holds in its hands frontage lands such as Egypt, the gateway to the Mediterranean, and South Africa, with the Cape of Good Hope controlling part of the Eurasian trade route. With such a complex residential area with many landowners, the Europeans argued so much that they had to come to a decision to hold a conference in Berlin, lasting for many sessions in 1884 and 1885. Finally, the nobles of Europe decided to divide this pie in a civilized way and act like gentlemen. But what is this civilization? It's very simple, my friends. Each country will be divided into spheres of influence based on their so-called Enlightenment achievements before the conference took place. And for our friend France, this gentleman will be divided into most of West Africa and Central Africa to become his garden and occasionally capture people to be slaves for the Enlightenment achievements. From then on, the colonial exploitation of France in particular and European countries in Africa took place more quickly and thoroughly than ever before. There was no longer any fear of being stabbed in the back by neighbors and having their colonies stolen. Since the Gentlemen's Conference, Africa was divided and every meter of land here was dug up, and people became nothing more than commodities. Colonization and plundering are common stories, but perhaps no country has created and possessed such cruel policies towards its colonized people as what the French colonialists did. In the countries under their control, the French implemented a special tax called the poll tax, which was levied even on minors. It fluctuated between 5 and 7 French francs per year. As long as you lived in the protectorate of the tricolor flag, you would have to pay taxes for your very existence. 5 to 7 francs a year may not sound like much, but in the 19th century under French oppression, that was the equivalent of months of hard labor. To pay the poll tax, an African man had several options, such as selling a goat to pay for a year's worth of taxes. But not everyone owned livestock, especially since white ownership was still in the hands of the whites. Simply go work on French plantations or factories, and that was both simple and profitable. The French had cheap, invincible, and loyal labor, because everyone feared not having enough money to pay their poll tax. And so, with a single policy, the French did not need to spend a penny to transport slaves to North America, but still created several generations of people loyal to the death under their bloody tricolor flag. Of course, people were not the only resource. France organized a large-scale exploitation of resources in Africa. Rubber in the Congo, cotton in Chad, gold and precious metals in Mali and Guinea, timber in Gabon, oil, and of course, not to forget, uranium later in Niger. And with such talent for plunder, it is no wonder that the profits from the African colonies each year jumped into France's own pockets to the tune of 38 million French francs a year. And I repeat, profit, not total revenue. But that is still not enough. How can a noble, beautiful, and superior race like France do such dirty, ugly work with muddy hands and feet? They had to do more noble things. France carried out a large-scale assimilation policy unprecedented in human history in this land. They imposed French language, culture, education, and laws on the indigenous people. They taught that French culture was noble, a civilized code that all mankind should admire. Meanwhile, they despised and destroyed local languages, customs, and beliefs. Africans were taught that their ancestors were unclean. Their language and writing were the product of base intellects. Their tribal culture was a disgrace to humanity. The result was a small indigenous class educated in the French style, which served as a ruling intermediary in place of the colonial government. That is why, in a video about leader Ibrahim Traoré that Kai Huyn Insights previously aired, he mentioned the concept that Africans born with the mentality of slaves will never be able to help the Black continent move forward. Of course, everything has to end. Colonialism is no exception. After the shame and humiliation that penetrated to the core, when the Austrian painter paraded his troops right at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, it must be said that France's influence on the international stage was falling rapidly. Its power receded like a crippled old general who thought he was in his 20s. The French were punched in the face by the Vietnamese Viet Minh to the point of rolling around and raising the white flag of surrender in 1954. That was also the milestone marking the collapse of the so-called once famous Great France. The 20th century saw the collapse of the French colonial system across Africa, from oil-rich Algeria to uranium-rich Niger. All regained their independence one by one, and the tricolor flag no longer flew in Africa. They were pushed out of here, like the way Macron was beaten by his wife before setting foot in Vietnam in May 2025. But in fact, that is only half true. The French are an extremely clever and talented people and know how to win people's hearts. It is not by chance that Macron made his final salute in front of President Ho Chi Minh's mausoleum. This is a diplomatic art of the French in particular and the West in general. A country that was once a slave to us now stands proudly before us. We say it is ironic. Back to the main story. Although they are called independent, in essence, the former French colonies are all dependent on the former mother country that once occupied them. If you remember above, I analyzed why Westerners easily invaded Africa. Then you will also understand why independence and autonomy are still a luxury in Africa. Africans are uneducated and easily influenced, so the leading governments are mostly extremely corrupt and poorly run. This, combined with the old French remnants, along with the generations of people who grew up under French education, leads to Africans themselves competing with each other in the way they run their countries. The simplest and most understandable is that they are easily manipulated by the French, or simply understood as the franc protectorate. The special thing about this currency is that it can be freely converted to the euro at will without changing the exchange rate between the euro and these two currencies. This is possible thanks to France's guarantee. So on the surface, these former colonies have in their hands a euro printing machine, not to mention the added prestige of being protected by France for its fledgling financial system. It sounds so sweet, like a mother's boundless love for her child. That's why in the country, using this protectorate franc, there are two friends. Guinea, Equator, formerly Spanish and Swiss Guinea, once in Portuguese hands. But wait, how could it be that easy? In order to use that money printing machine, these 14 countries had to send half of their foreign exchange reserves to France as a guarantee. So here, Kihuin Insights would like to tell you that what people often call colonial tax literally no longer exists. Of course, it still exists figuratively, but you have to use this phrase at the right time, right moment, everyone. By its very nature, France did not force these countries to join the bloc using the franc protectorate. There have been cases of voluntary departure from this bloc, but the consequence, of course, was the loss of the ability to exchange foreign currencies extremely strongly and quickly. Not to mention the very high possibility that these leaders will soon have the opportunity to return to their ancestors, thanks to the copper candy coming from the muzzles of their compatriots who were paid a few pennies by the French themselves. That is what happened to Sylvanus Olympio, the president of Togo, when he decided to print new money for his country. French companies such as Orano, and especially Akeva in the uranium mining in Niger, continued to control strategic resources in Africa. Although in the name of investment, these activities often caused most of the profits to flow out of Africa, while the local people remained in poverty. Let me give you a small example. In 2023, a kilogram of uranium is worth about $120 per kilogram. But the uranium that Akeva mines and sells to France is worth 0.8 euros per kilogram, a depreciation rate so insane that it is hard to believe. And perhaps that is also part of the reason why France has been and is the country with the most and cheapest nuclear power in the world. Not to mention their only nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in Europe, the Charles de Gaulle. However, the world is changing. Africa is no longer the silent continent it once was. Voices of protest, aspirations for true independence and justice are rising strongly. Only when African nations are fully in control of their economies, resources, and ideas can the specter of colonialism be truly dispelled. People like the great Ibrahim Traoré are the strong voice that is causing France to decline day by day before the wave of the new era is flooding into the country, which they still proudly call the symbol of civilization. In your opinion, is the price that France is paying now worth it? Discuss with me in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Now, goodbye and see you again.